Here, 4 speakers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. I haven't met you all yet, but I'm looking forward to hearing you speak. My name is David Hick. I'm from the University of Alberta, and I'm president of the International Arctic Science Committee. The session on adaptation to socio-economic changes in the Arctic will run until lunch, of course, and I think we have lots of time for the speakers. And would you prefer to answer questions following your speaking, or would you like to save that until the end? Do you have a preference?
I would save it so we get a little bit dialogue.
Yeah, I think I'd like to save it to the end, because that way we make certain that we have time for all of your presentations. You are limited to 15 minutes absolutely, and I will let you know when you're at 2 minutes. So without further ado then, my last question is whether there's a young researcher who was asked to be a rapporteur for this session. You are, okay, thank you very much. So you'll be taking notes, thanks. Right, so our first speaker is Elín Ebba Ásmundsdóttir, who is an associate professor of health sciences at the University of Akureyri, and will be speaking on enabling social capital in the Arctic. So please. And I can't tell which.
No, it's enabling.
Oh, here we go. Okay, this one here. Good.
Control you a little bit because we are so few.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask you to come closer so we, feel that we are a group, not this individual all over the place? Because I think we will get a better dialogue afterwards. And the first 2 rows, for example, you are so comfortable there. But it's. I think that we should tighten. Can I ask you to set the next slide? Can you be a slide?
I can do that if you like, yes. Yes, and I don't think you need to use the microphone.
No, because we are with you.
Very good. So then,
Can you gather in the middle? You får börja näst till och med. Det är så läckert. Ja. These classrooms are not made for dialogues, because you will get some distance. Okay, nobody in the middle.
so let's see. There is, if you want to
No,
control.
I don't need that. Don't.
Okay, I can do that.
Help me to keep on the track.
Okay.
So you can put the next, please. My name is Elín Ebba Ásmundsdóttir, and I have been working in psychiatry all my life. And the last 13 years at the university. What has changed me is the way I'm working with people, because before we were, as a clinical, we were always working, trying to do what research was telling us, I was not a researcher myself. And then suddenly when I started to work with users, if you can talk about the users like the natives, it changed just how I work and how I approach things today. So I want to share with you 3 different approaches which I have experience in, and how you can work with people, enable them, and it's called empowerment. A lot of words is used on it, and I hope that I can inspire you. And a lot of things that I've been doing is in cohesion with what you said this morning, all the people who are talking to this morning. We are trying to get a dialogue and trying to get out the knowledge and experience to change the system. And to make a better system also makes a better society. And I have often used the explanation that as a researcher you have a lot of tools that you learn, but when you are in certain areas, no tools can work, and you have to use the knowledge of those who are at stake. Like in my example, the users. Can you put the next? Yeah. The first project is a mental health promotion, and that didn't start. It was before.
This one?
It didn't start from health professionals. It was the user who had been sick himself. He was a doctor student, and he got diagnosis manic depressive. And when he got his, his health back again, he noticed that nobody wanted to work. He didn't get any work. and nobody wanted to marry him. It was a lot of stigma around to be a mental health patient. And he was astonished that he couldn't come out to the society and say that he has been sick and got better, and he didn't get any chance. So it was his, beginning that he wanted to do something about it, and that the concept mental health promotion started. It was just 1999 here in Iceland. We didn't have this concept. We call it Grantwriting in Icelandic, those who are Icelandic here. And he got all the people that, stand there with him, maybe because he was a little bit crazy. Because he had this vision and nobody stopped him. If he would be a normal guy, I didn't think that he could have done all of this. Because he really pushed things forward. And we would have called him in a hypomanic or manic stage in the beginning. So he got something done. So often you have to think, maybe some of the things that we see as symptoms can be used for the good of others. Maybe it's not good for him, but maybe it's good for others. So that was, next please, and this is his, you can see his face. I put the picture of him. And the motivation why he got a lot of people with him was that we are using a lot of money out of natural production. And 1 out of every 4 people that get mental health diagnosis, get disabled, and there's a lot of cost for the society. And just to give you some figures, that there are all those who get this label of severe mental health problems, 75 to 80%, it's different to countries, and it can vary a little bit lower, a little bit higher, have both the skill and will to work, but 60 to 90% are without employment. This is a huge amount of our social capital that we don't use. And that we have to work on, and the things that we have been using today, that's mostly in psychiatry, are not lowering those who get disabled and those who get work. So we have to find other ways. Next, please. And through this production, what was mental health promotion, and the knowledge came from the grassroots, what they thought was valuable. It didn't come from, it didn't come from anything that we could find in the textbook. And these are the 2 examples, what came out of it and is still living in Iceland. It's what you can do every day to embrace your mental health. And it doesn't matter if you're in the Arctic or wherever you are, everybody has mental health. And this was just 10 very easy things that people should do every day. And what was done with it? It was kindergarten, universities, high schools. They have taken one word and work around it. We had radio programs, we had workshops. We did a lot of things with these easy words, what people could do every day to keep their mental health good. And also, we made a box that people, just like you have a box when you cut yourself, and you have to put something on it so it doesn't swell up, that people could make their own boxes that they could look into if they found that they came home from work sad, or children had some kind of things in school, that people could learn how to use this box just like the eight. Yeah. And a lot of projects came out of it. Students have done a school project that they built their box and they put in it, and they had discussion groups, and it was a very interesting 7 weeks master's program that the nurses did who were working in schools, that they made the full package, and they are trying to work with it more so other countries can use it, would be used with children. And also it came a lot of kindergarten projects that the kids begin to think about their mental health when they're young, so it would be just, like drinking water and brushing your teeth. So this is something that really was a success, and this came out of the grassroots, and this has a lot of empowerment involved. So this is mental health promotion project. Next, please. The other project that I have been involved with was expanding choices. Those who have mental health diagnosis before 1980, nobody asked them what they thought. No research was done that they were asked if this was helping them or not. They were just doing this comparison groups, if you're using this kind of medication or this kind of treatment, who is doing better. Nobody was asking them. So we thought, because we saw the statistic that we were not getting more people out to work and we were not getting fewer mental health patients, that we had to ask them, and this have started all around the world. So we were just following other grassroots movements in Europe and in the States. And I conducted that research, and I was assessing what helped and hinders people in the environment, and I wanted to influence policy making and also to change the mental health system. Next, please. And I used quality research, and I talked to people who had recovered, or they looked at themselves as recovered. And what I did was I had with me users, so they would look into the data and see what they saw into it, because I can see one thing, but the people who are experiencing these things, they see different things. So what has come out of that is there have already come new services which are driven by their perspective. Next, please. And just to see what they put in the front line, human rights. I, as a health professional, was not taught about human rights when I was in school. So that they wanted something more in medicine. They wanted recovery on own terms. They wanted independence and a lot of things. And a lot of things that they said was not the same things that the parents said or the relatives. Just that they know. This is often conflicting. Parents have other things that they want to work with and the users. And I'm not gonna read it up, but I could hear some of your things like, holding hopes and having dreams, not take that away from people. It doesn't matter if the climate is warming or you're using your health. You want to be in control in your own life, and you want to be heard. And they also did a lot of things that they wanted help with coping with school or work and relationships. This was not put on agenda before it's not in the traditional health systems. And they want to work with prejudice and stigma and discrimination, and they really want a supporting environment, and they want people in the services to talk together and have some kind of a follow-up, which they don't live. They find that they are always going places to places, and nobody is having a big picture. Okay, next. I have to be in time. Next, please. This is a center that I run now that was produced out of these results, because what they wanted a place, they wanted a place where they could stay active. They didn't want any referrals. They just wanted to be in a surrounding where there were people that they could find time and take part of a lot of things that they choose. So this day center, it's open for everybody. It's not just mental health. It's foreigners, it's poor people, it's people that are unemployed, and a lot of people came after the crisis here in Iceland. And I really want to take this idea and put it in the healthcare system, that when you go into a healthcare station, you just don't meet doctors and nurses. You can also have the social system, but you can also have an activity center, because you often get sick of being isolated and not heard, and not being with other people. So I really want to take this idea, and we could take it, if we collaborate, that we look at the health in a different way. We have health care and not always taking care of symptoms, that is after you gotten sick. And just who attend, it's often Indians who live alone, who are poor, and it's minority groups. And for me, it was really difficult to lose this control of assessing people people and making what I've been taught in school. I have had to change a lot of things how I've been trained if I really am going to tune in what people want. Next. Next slide, please. This was creating new to validate that people can make choices, and we really want to work more on this. We want people to have safe houses that they can choose between going to a mental state hospital or safe hospital as just users. But this is one of the creation of things that they were, they really wanted to work. It was same here as in other countries that people really wanted to work. How can you make work when you have not attended school and you have not what all the others have because you've been maybe sick for many years, but you have valuable experience. So what we did, we took students from the University of Akureyri, we trained them with users to do research on the places that were giving services, that they should themselves be the researchers and collecting the data and interpreting the data. The students got assignment that they should teach them everything that they had learned here at the University of Quality Research and they were working with groups, and they went into the hospital and more places and did these interviews. And this program was so good that we got the President of Iceland, who they were nominated as one of the best projects that year. And what we did was we held workshop all over Iceland to distribute what came out of this. They were asking users at the services what they were. 2 minutes, okay? Yeah, and the motivation for that program was that it was politic. Politicians really want to do good things, but they don't know how to do it. And we were trying to, enforce civil role and rights, and we wanted this to be part of the policy making. And the multi-personalities, I can't say this, they shouldn't get finance if they didn't do research where they asked people how they were, interpreting the service. Okay, I have to, what have come out of those, these are people that got work through this project, and these are also the 2 students that were involved. This is what they say if they get work, but maybe they don't work 100%, maybe they just work 30%. But getting work where you really are using your resources and what you're good at, it really changes your life. And you can see the headlines, what they have said, that this has value for them. It helps them also to get out from the edge and becoming normal, and also have a cause to fight for, because they were the main part in the research. Next, I'm just going to show you. This is just, what is this called? This is not, next. The role that I am in, I use my knowledge to help them get the knowledge they need to take the data. I also am with them in the dialogue conferences, because we have these dialogue conferences that we invite everybody concerns, both who are running the system, also the parents and the local community. And I have to take as a researcher stand with those who we are investigating, and they also have a copyright of rights. Just if you see, it's equal and collaboration. And I will tell you, this is not easy when you are trained in an academic system that tells you that you should not, be unequal to a person, and you should have some kind of a distance when you're helping other people. So this is not easy. It's easy with words, but it's not easy in practice. Next, please, I'm really finished. This is all the things that we have been doing and what kind of reports we have done. I'm not going to look into that. We also compared surveys and this kind of a question. I don't have time for that. This is the last. What is this? If we use the results of these 3 projects, it means that we need healthcare reform, we need educational reform and workplace reform. We have a lot of things that we need to work on. And it's very difficult for me to be in the university system where you have this credit for what you do, because you should always be researching and you should always be reporting articles. Then I don't have the time to use my knowledge and skill working with the grassroots. And we have to change the university to give people that are really working with the, what you call the initiatives or the people that are living in the Arctic, if we are going to get people that really go into it. Because you don't get any credit for this. So I have become less and less academic now the last years, and more with the grassroots, because I see it's a lot of things that I have to work with to enable these people, and I will not score as high as academic. So they will lose me in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will have time for questions at the end. What I'd like to do now is introduce our next speaker, Noor Johnson. Noor has completed her doctoral work at McGill University in Canada this year, and is now at Brown University as a postdoctoral researcher. I'm in a bit of trouble because I didn't wire you as we're supposed to. So if you'd like to stand over there, we need to use this. If you'd like to use this, then we'll be able to capture it on the recording. And I'll turn it over to you right now.
Thanks,
All yours.
David. Okay, great. Well, I was really inspired by Ebba's call to practice. I thought that was really valuable. And I'm going to return to a more academic discussion here. But I hope that we can sort of talk more about this in our discussion that we're going to have time for at the end. Let's see, PowerPoint. It's giving me a little bit of trouble here, but I think, is this working?
I know what to do.
Oh, okay.
Let's
Okay. While David is working on this, I'm going to start, just in the interest of time. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and what I want to talk about today is thinking about adaptation in Arctic communities. But in my research, I found that a lot of the way that people think about adaptation is to think mostly exclusively about the environmental impacts of climate change and how people are adapting to those impacts. And when I spent time in northern communities in Canada, what I found was that the way people experience change is very holistic, and people tend to have a lot of different diverse stresses in their lives that they have to deal with and accommodate, and that a lot of times those other stresses are very pressing, and that adaptation to a lot of people at the community level, thank you, David, includes thinking about how to deal with bureaucracy and how to deal with the way that governments are channeling resources and funding in the name of adaptation to local communities. And so that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today. So adaptation to climate change is widely considered to be a local process affecting local people. And in the Canadian Arctic context, considerable academic work has been devoted to documenting local observations of changes and examining vulnerability to these changes at the community scale. But at the same time, the idea of adaptation is not a self-evidently local concept. Adaptation policies are often determined by people far removed from local scale observations and vulnerabilities. And the term itself has origins in the natural and social sciences and has been used most often in global and national debates and discussions about environmental change. So what I want to do is to use the tools of ethnography and ethnographic analysis to think about adaptation as basically a networked practice, and to follow an anthropologist, Annalise Riles, in doing what she calls turning the network inside out, to think about the kinds of communication practices and technologies that link particular communities with the government agencies charged with assessing climate change threats and facilitating responses. And so in particular, I'm going to look at the role of grant writing. And my focus on grant writing draws on recent scholarship on the impacts of neoliberalism on non-governmental institutions. So government reforms over the past decades have eliminated a lot of core or block funding for nonprofits, shifting instead to a project funding model in which nonprofit staff must juggle grant applications and reporting requirements to meet their overhead expenses. In this environment, grant writing has become the primary mechanism that local institutions use to secure the funds that they need to keep their doors opened, to keep their lights on, to keep the heat on, and to pay their staff. And this is a phenomenon that anthropologist Pamela Stern has called the proposal economy. So the proposal economy is evident in the climate change adaptation initiatives of the Canadian government, particularly those aimed at engaging First Nations and Inuit communities. And funding for climate adaptation in Canada has been channeled through 3 federal agencies, primarily Natural Resources Canada, Health Canada, and Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada. And this funding has been awarded to specific projects through a series of internal and external grant-making processes. And these initiatives translate and translocate the idea of adaptation, which is born in international political negotiations, into local communities through these programs and projects. So what I want to do is look at 2 examples of what I'm talking about. And the first one is an example of an adaptation program run through Health Canada's Climate and Health Adaptation in Inuit and First Nations Communities initiative. So in order to qualify for funding through this program, community institutions first have to identify impacts of climate change in their communities, and then they have to associate these impacts with physical, cultural, or mental health. And so when Health Canada first set up this project, what they did was they ran a series of capacity building training sessions throughout the Canadian North. And at these sessions, they basically tried to help communities make these connections that they needed to be able to make in order to write a grant proposal, in order to secure funding to run an adaptation initiative or project. And so this is a quote from one of the Health Canada staff members about what they did during these capacity building workshops. Basically, she says, in these workshops, the participants were invited to share their perception on the changes they were seeing, and then it was jointly determined which of these changes could be linked to climate, and in turn, how that could be linked to health and well-being. And then, once people became familiar with this language, they were invited to imagine projects that they might propose to Health Canada to have funded through this program. And in his work on political rationality and state power, Nicholas Rose has described translation as a process that, quote, links the general to the particular, links one place to another, shifts a way of thinking from a political center to a cabinet office, a government department, to a multitude of workplaces. And so in this example, Health Canada employees were working with community members to translate a series of diverse observations and experiences into a particular understanding of health and climate change. So the next capacity building task that these staff members then had to accomplish was to help communities translate this newly identified relationship between climate impacts and health into the form of a funding proposal and a budget. And so what they did was, in these workshops, they developed mock proposals that included all of the trappings of bureaucratic grant writing. And these are, I'm not going to go through this quote, but these are all of the different things that they tried to encourage participants to learn how to do. And so in the context of this climate change and health adaptation program, capacity building enrolled local actors into a particular way of understanding and acting on change by making connections between health and a changing climate. And it also involved transmitting bureaucratic skills so that local actors could participate in proposal writing, thus linking localities with these wider visions and approaches to addressing environmental change. So this brief discussion of capacity building suggests a one-way translation of adaptation concepts into local communities through the mediation of government employees. But this is really only one side of the story because translation goes both ways. So the second example that I want to use is also coming from this same initiative, but it's looking at how communities can use their own agency and sort of deploy the technologies of grant writing in order to ensure that their own visions and priorities endure and are supported through these different projects. So this is an example from the community of Clyde River, which is in the Nunavut territory on Baffin Island. It's a small community of about 1,000 people, and most of them are Inuit. And in Clyde River, there's a really wonderful community-based health and wellness organization called Illisaksivik. And Illisaksivik delivers just a tremendous variety of really helpful, critically needed projects in the community. And most of these projects are funded through grants. So they have to write grants to fund all of these different services that they deliver to the community. So in 2009, Illisaksivik received funding from Health Canada's Climate Change and Health Adaptation program to conduct an Inuit women's berry picking retreat. And the goals of this retreat were to support women in enlarging and strengthening their support networks in the context of social and environmental change, and to document women's knowledge and observations of environmental change in an informal way while spending time together on the land. And this was, Health Canada had emphasized a participatory community-led approach. So communities were supposed to be sort of proposing and running their own processes of research on climate change. So 21 women from the two communities, Clyde River and the nearby community of Qikiqtarjuaq, spent 5 days together harvesting crowberries and the small Arctic blueberries that cover the landscape in late summer. And while they were on the land together, the women didn't really talk about climate change or even the broader category of environmental change. Instead, the participants focused on how the land offered a source of support and well-being when other parts of their lives felt difficult to control. So in the stories that they told each other and in their approach to being on the tundra together, instead of extracting information from the tundra, as a scientist might do, environmental knowledge and social processes were interwoven together. And after the retreat, Illisaksivik submitted a report to Health Canada. It really summarized the retreat activities and emphasized the holistic vision of change that had emerged from the conversations of the women during the retreat. So one of the group conversations that they had was centered around this question: what do you think it means to be a good person or to be a good woman? And this was a question that the participants had come up with themselves, and it really was intended to prompt people to reflect on Inuit women's lives in their totality. So in the report back to Health Canada, Illisaksivik said, one might not think that being a good person would fit within a climate change-centered project, but it is precisely by being a good, healthy person in a healthy community that we will be able to deal with any change that comes our way. And a Health Canada staff member responded to this report with a request for more specific information linking climate change and health. And they said, could you share the data that was collected? What are the changes being observed by the women? So you might have actually anticipate this response. This is sort of a typical bureaucratic response, and indeed, not out of the ordinary. Health Canada and the community members involved in the retreat really had two very different conceptions of how climate change should be understood and prioritized. So while the women focused on change as it emerged from the total environment of family, animals, tundra, sea ice, and settlement, Health Canada staff wanted the project to yield clear connections between health on the one hand and the environment on the other. So how were these different understandings negotiated? Well, Illisaksivik submitted a second revised report, and in it they drew on a survey that they had administered after the retreat was over, which had a clearer emphasis on country food, health, and environmental change. And this met Health Canada's need for data. And the revised report, however, also critiqued the assumption that was embedded in the framing provided by Health Canada that, quote, what women wanted to talk about regarding climate change was observations of change. It re-articulated the women's relational conception that engaging with and responding to change means being a strong woman, having strong families, and joining together as a community. So in this example, the report document served as a technology through which Illisaksivik was able to mediate between different visions and understandings of change. And this reflects what David Moss and David Lewis have referred to as brokerage. which involves mediating or translating between, quote, different rationalities, interests, and meanings so as to produce order, legitimacy, and success, and to maintain funding flows. So what I hope that these examples show is that climate adaptation is not a predominantly local activity. Rather, it is imagined and enacted through networks that tie government bureaucracies with local institutions and actors. Local communities must increasingly adapt not only to changes in the tundra and sea ice, but also, and perhaps more critically, to the bureaucratic and social infrastructures that shape and limit the possibilities for action locally. And documents, particularly grant proposals and reports, are, I think, a very fruitful space within these networks in which to understand how different visions of change, of possibility, of desired action or inaction are reconciled. And while I argue that adaptation is networked, not local, I also suggest that these networks are fraught and uneven. As Sally Engel-Mary has suggested, translation takes place within fields of unequal power. Moreover, translators work within established discursive fields that constrain the repertoire of ideas and practices available to them. So translation is never neutral. Not all actors share the same access to resources or the same ability to determine what visions and understandings of change should be privileged over others. And studies of bureaucratic networks, documents, and translation, I think, are a necessary but as yet underdeveloped component on research on climate change in Northern Territories. A focus on translation within uneven fields of power shows us how global conceptions of climate change are introduced to local communities through capacity building initiatives. And it also demonstrates the role of skillful brokerage on the part of local institutions, which can facilitate funding flows even in the context of divergent perspectives on change. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Noor. I'm not going to touch any of the technology. I'll turn that over to you. Our next speaker is Andréa Finger from the the University of Applied Sciences in Western Switzerland. And your talk will come up in just 1 minute. You'll be speaking on agency as redefined by climate change, the case of the Arctic.
This one, yeah, Andréa Mattis. Thank you very much. So, good morning. Yes, I will. Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you some work in progress. I see that our presentations have so far all an agency approach, actor-based approach. I think this is too the case here. It's maybe a little bit more theoretical, but the aim is to come up with methods which should foster collective learning, which is grounded from the local to the global, I would say. So we have commonalities, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on together. We are 3 people who have worked on this presentation. Matthias Finger in this room too, my husband, and Amin Dedarian, who is unfortunately not here, works in Lausanne, a doctoral student who works on system analysis. Okay. So the research questions and objectives. First, our very simple question, but difficult to answer, is who can do what for the Arctic to adapt to climate change and to contribute to the mitigation of emissions, which is, of course, a global problem. I should say we come from France, Switzerland, from the Alps, which have also melting glaciers, and who are also struggling with adaptation, as you can imagine very well. Here we have in common also living modes, lifestyles, which are based on globalized fossil fuel industrial development, I see it here going on like it is in our countries, in France and Switzerland. We have a common interest here for the region, of course, within the region, for the residents of the regions, and also for humanity. The discourse of the President of Iceland this morning was very meaningful in this respect. So our objective is to develop a framework to conceptualize the Arctic as an integrated system. Of course, we're not going to develop it from scratch. We're going to be inspired for different frameworks which have already been sketched out, and so we will discuss some of those most interesting frameworks according to us, which we know of. And I'd like to know more about the indigenous framework we heard about this morning too. So it's all in progress and open to dialogue and exchange. So this framework is based first on the identification of stakeholders who are concerned by climate change and their interactions among themselves in and around the Arctic. This framework is also in need of a model for conceptualizing what are the various actors' choices for reaching sustainable natural resource uses in the case of the Arctic. So it's really for enhancing collective learning again, for the actors to know what would be the best choices for the agency. So we start out with a social historical approach. We have published a little article in the Arctic Yearbook last year. So we have studied what were agency changes in Arctic environmental policy over the last 25 years, since Murmansk and discourse of Mikhail Gorbachev in '87. That was the topic of the Arctic Yearbook last year. We do not patron regime theory here because we really consider actors in a broad approach where the state and the nation state is not necessarily at the center or external actor which dominates the others. We have within the 25 years of Arctic Environmental Agency identified 4 main periods which are distinguished according to who are the actors taking part in the discourse and changing really the tone of the discourse. So in the Cold War period, at the very end of it, we had really the East-West blocks of states, so the state discourse was very strong and very caught up in this East-West conflict. And on the other hand, a strong peace and environmental movement trying to get out of this trap of militarization, of nuclear arsenal build-up in the Arctic. Arctic was seen also as in the light of Arctic haze, of a place which was all of a sudden not a virgin place, but a place which was suffering also from impacts coming from outside its region. And it wasn't yet seen really as an inhabited place or very sparsely inhabited place. It didn't have yet really a voice of its own at this stage, we think, at least in the international discourse. Immediately after Cold War, we have big powers and scientists which really take, again, a leadership in the discourse on the Arctic. And it changes a bit with onset around the Rio Conference in the early 90s, where, interestingly, that was also the end of the Cold War. We have Arctic voices rising. We have indigenous peoples in the Arctic and outside the Arctic who are coming on the stage and expressing their ways of perceiving problems, and we have also environmental NGOs and other non-state-based actors like the regions, which are increasing their visibility. In the early 21st century, again, there's kind of a return of the nation state. We have big concerns about climate change, which shows really visible impacts and changes the or the situation of the Arctic, as I'm not going to repeat, it was well done this morning. But what is really different is that transnational corporations and state-owned enterprises are becoming, next to the nation states, big players in what the Arctic, how the Arctic is being perceived and how it is being, let's say, envisioned for its future development. So we have, in the stakeholder analysis, we have tried to look where are the different actors, from nation states to TNCs, but also a whole series of other actors, which are civil society associations and citizens, indigenous peoples, who are represented in the Arctic Council or who may not, the Arctic Council, etc. We have looked at all the different actors, scientific organizations and non-Arctic states and NGOs, etc. And we have tried to look at how much we could distinguish their position in the Arctic system according to their power, their legitimacy, and how they perceive the urgency of the situation. And we can really see here that we can, according to Mitchell, I don't know, probably some people here know who about this scheme, which is drawn from Mitchell, where we can locate the actors in this according to whether they have a definitive power, which is in the center, definitive power and a definitive position as decision makers, which is recognized with its legitimacy. But their interest here is really mostly on the Arctic resources, and maybe climate change is just an interest to them insofar it hampers business as usual and industrial development. So we have definitive actors, which are also state-owned enterprises. They have a legitimacy because they are state-based. But then we have other actors like the transnational corporations, which have power, yes, indeed, which have less legitimacy, which have a sense of urgency, but basically to go for the resources, which is as you know, in our Arctic, of big interest. So those actors, according to this scheme, are said to be dangerous, okay, because they have power, but they don't really have legitimacy, and they're not really first-hand concerned about TNCs, but more about resources, etc. We can go on for this exercise. What is interesting now to really note is that civil society associations, people working with the local communities, and indigenous peoples represented in the indigenous peoples in general, citizens of the Arctic, residents of the Arctic, are the people who have power if they take the voice to express it, if they organize. They have legitimacy, certainly, indeed. And they have concerns about climate change. As we see, adaptation is something they experience in their daily lives. And they are also in need of resources for their livelihoods, especially people who depend directly on the near environment. So those categories are dependent kind of stakeholders in this analysis. I cannot go, for the time I have here, into more details, but there are also categories of stakeholders analyzed as demanding, which are they don't really have the legitimacy to have a decision-making power. They don't really have, or let's say, a recognized legitimacy, because this legitimacy is also always something you have to struggle for and have recognized again and again. It's conflictive as a process to have it recognized. So I would say here just that non-Arctic states and international environmental NGOs, organizations are in this demanding position where they say we have a stake, we are concerned, we have interest in both climate change impacts and the resources as well, since you know that many non-Arctic states are in the Arctic also for its resources, including Switzerland. Okay, we have here. Our interest is really to build on Ostrom's et al. Social ecological systems as a framework because it integrates both social and ecological interactions. That's why we are really interested in. It enters into this understanding that the environment is a total environment, as maybe Noor just said, for the people who live in and from it. It considers the common interests of the communities and the importance to consider collective choices or networks that rules are kind of emerging of those networks and not just for single actors-based processes or few which. So I'd like here just to say that this model has some problems for us. It is not if we apply it at the level of the Arctic because of boundaries problems which are not clearly defined, because it doesn't include non-renewable natural resources in the model or in the framework, because the Arctic region cannot be really considered as really self-organizing because it's completely integrated in global exchanges. Okay. Mm-hmm. So. We have also a problem with this framework because it doesn't include considerations of technology as mediating between actors and ecological systems as a factor you need to take into account. It downplays outside factors because it sees the system as semi-open, and we challenge it because the Arctic is really kind of a very open system. So it doesn't. Another big problem is it doesn't really account for tipping points. That's when the quality of the system may change because we are going beyond equilibrium points, and where the resilience really, as we would like to see it happen, is maybe not anymore at work, where you will have to change basic practices and ways of looking at problems too. So this framework of Ostrom et al. Is not sufficient for us, and we are looking for other kinds of methodologies in order to operationalize a framework which is more integrated of the other aspects which are missing in the one we have just discussed. So we think that agent-based modeling and system dynamics should be combined to some respect to have an approach which can help us address still be actor-based, be inclusive of, be integrating their own interests and their own needs, as you also have this approach for mental health. It's actor-based. You have to have a system which is integrating social and ecological variables. I think that's a good thing about Ostrom's framework, but this is not easy to implement, especially when you're working in universities where the disciplines prevent us from doing that. And then we have to integrate technological change, and technological change is also often done by local communities, so it doesn't have to be come from only universities or the so-called dominant or big players. We have to have bottom-up approaches which rely on extensive data, which is also based on observation, which people closer to the environment can give. And we have to bring in this notion that systems can change and have longer-term dynamics as possibilities. Not just day-to-day adaptation is key, but we need to have different time frames in our models and methodologies. Okay, so I think 0 minute is finished. Actually, I sum up with this what we need from. So we are still working on it, and so the discussion will be important for us to see how we can progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Our final speaker, before we have a round of sessions, is Robin Bronen, who is the Executive Director of the Alaska Institute for Justice. And today she'll speak on relocation as an adaptation strategy in Alaska. Use the microphone recording.
Okay.
It's captured.
And I'm not sure where he put it, because I don't think, no, it's not that one.
Prezi, or is it?
No, he, and I brought it again, so I
Maybe
kind
we'll
of,
just load it up on
because I
here.
think, because I don't know where he put
Yeah,
it.
I didn't see it either. There we go.
Okay. And it's, yep, right there. No, this one, yep. And this to move it forward.
Yeah, and backwards.
Okay. And then F5 to, okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So it's just like that. Up and down, actually.
Up and down?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So first I want to thank Patricia Cochran, who's in the room, for her leadership in Alaska and addressing the issues of climate change, and for her excellent presentation this morning. And part of my presentation is going to repeat some of the things that she said, so I apologize for that. I work as a human rights attorney. I've worked in Alaska for 25 years as a human rights attorney, and I decided to go back to graduate school in 2007 because I was so concerned about climate change in my state and start to understand the science of climate change. And so as Patricia was talking about this morning, we are already experiencing extreme temperature increases with 3.5 degrees Celsius already in the winter time, which is causing the permafrost to thaw. And most significant, we have had record levels of minimum Arctic sea ice extent since 2007. So the story that I always tell is, when I entered graduate school in 2007, I went to my first environmental conference, and at that time, climate scientists were saying that there would be no Arctic sea ice at the earliest 2050 and probably 2100. Last summer, we had another record minimum low of Arctic sea ice, which was recorded 3 weeks earlier than normal at the end of August. And now they're thinking that there will be no Arctic sea ice during the summertime as early as 2020 to 2030. So in the span of just 6 years, that has, by 8 decades, they've downgraded the amount of time in which Arctic sea ice may no longer exist in the summertime. And this is having profound impacts on the coastal communities in Alaska. So I work as an immigration attorney, and the work that I started to do in Alaska in regard to my research was in regard to the term climate refugees. And I was trying to figure out if there was any connection between the climate refugees or political refugees and the community relocations happening in Alaska, and the answer is absolutely not. There is no connection between the two. And so the significant piece to the community relocations happening in Alaska is that the U.S. federal government has done numerous reports on the issue of erosion and flooding. So the decreased Arctic sea ice combined with the thawing of the permafrost is causing accelerated rates of erosion, which is then threatening the habitability of coastal communities. And so in 2003, the federal government did their first report, and at that time they found that 3 communities were seeking to relocate, and 84 other communities were threatened by flooding and erosion. And again, just 6 years later, they found that that number of communities that were seeking to relocate had quadrupled to 12, and that there were 31 imminently threatened. So these are the 12 imminently threatened communities that are seeking to, in some form, relocate. And not all of them are thinking about relocating their community in their entirety. Some of them are going to be able to gradually migrate because they have land that is close to where they currently are located so that they can move infrastructure to a higher location. The communities that I'm going to focus on are Shishmaref, Kivalina, and Newtok, because they are the communities that are going to have to relocate in their entirety. So Shishmaref, and the thing is, the other piece that's really important to understand about the community relocations in Alaska is these communities have done everything possible to alert government officials about what's happening in their community. They've been extraordinarily proactive in trying to address the challenges that they're faced with. And the challenge is that what we're faced with community relocations is something that has never been actually addressed in the United States before. So these things that I'm going to mention for each of the communities are the same. There have been repeated extreme weather events that have caused disasters in really short periods of time. So between 2001 and 2005, there were 3 extreme weather events where flood disasters were declared. The U.S. and state governments have spent millions of dollars on erosion control. And the piece that's also critical about this is that the technology is not able to protect the communities in place. And so we are using the best technology available. That technology is not able to protect people in place. And finally, and this is what's really significant, is that for each of these communities, they voted to relocate. So the traditional councils of each community recognized that there was a problem. They looked for land around the areas where they currently lived. They took the issue to the community members and voted multiple times to relocate and to a location that all of their community members agreed was a good location to relocate to. The challenge is after going through this process, state and federal government officials said the place where you want to relocate to is not an appropriate place. We're not going to support you in that effort because the permafrost is going to thaw, and so you need to find another place to relocate to. Kivalina is the other community that I mentioned. Again, this community experienced 6 extreme weather events in 5 years, which accelerated the rate of erosion. The most recent extreme weather event, there was the largest storm ever in the Bering Sea that occurred in 2011. And then because of the permafrost thawing, there was a state disaster declaration declared because the permafrost thawing was affecting the potable water, which prevented the children from going to school, and so they actually lost 3 weeks of school this past year. And in Kivalina, as with Shishmaref, so in 2006, federal government spent millions of dollars to build this seawall right here, and on the day of its dedication ceremony, and our federal delegation, our U.S. Senator at the time, flew in to celebrate its completion. A storm came in and 180 feet were destroyed. The year later, 3/4 of the community needed to be evacuated. There is a new seawall in place that was built, I believe, in 2009 and completed in 2010. And the government is saying that that seawall will protect this community for another 10 to 15 years. Again, this community voted to relocate. They found a relocation site, and after going through the process of finding the relocation, state government came in and said, we're not going to relocate you to this place because we think the permafrost is going to thaw and it's not going to be a good place for you to go in the long term. Newtok is the community that I'm actually most familiar with. I focus most of my research on this community because unlike Kivalina and Shishmaref, this community is actively in a relocation process. So again, same scenario where you've got multiple extreme weather events in short periods of time, erosion control tried and failed with millions of dollars being spent. And the crisis for these communities and living in an uninhabitable place, I cannot overemphasize that. So in Newtok, and the Newtok Traditional Council released this information. 29% of the children have lower respiratory tract infections. That was from a report done in 2006, I believe, from the local public health clinic. And they have, because of the extreme weather events and the accelerated rates of erosion, they've lost major infrastructure in their community, including their barge landing. Their potable water source is being affected by salt water, and their sanitary sewage system is also being impacted. As I mentioned, the traditional councils of each of these communities has gone to extraordinary lengths to protect their communities. So each of these communities have been documenting the erosion for decades. The Newtok Traditional Council started documenting the erosion in 1983. They identified 6 potential relocation sites. The community voted 3 times to relocate, and then they actually hired a lobbyist to lobby Congress to do a federal land exchange with the U.S. government, which was authorized in 2003. And that is the location that the Newtok community is relocating to. It's a location 9 miles south of the community across the Ninglick River. And so that's the research that I focused on. And one of the things that was extraordinary or is extraordinary about Newtok's relocation is the Newtok Planning Group formed in 2006 after the community got land title to their relocation site. And the Newtok Planning Group is this ad hoc group of 25 federal, state, and tribal governments, agencies that have no mandate to relocate the community of Newtok. There's no relocation funding available, and yet these governmental and non-governmental agencies are working together really hard to relocate the community. And the barriers have been absolutely enormous. Every step of the way, there has been an issue that nobody thought of, not the governmental agencies, not members of the tribe, that have delayed their relocation process. And so the example that I give is they have been unable to build a school at their relocation site because there are not 10 children at their relocation site who could enroll in school. And so when it comes to state government funding priorities, they're at the lower end of the list because there's no population base at their relocation site. And I should mention that their relocation site, there's no infrastructure there. There was no infrastructure there before the Newtok Planning Group developed a plan and started to build the barge landing. They've got a road, they've got a beginning of an evacuation center. And then Stanley Tom is the tribal administrator for the Newtok Traditional Council, and he has done incredible work to get money for housing. And so there are now 6 houses at the relocation site. So based on all of the information that I just shared, it was clear to me that there's a problem in the way that we are in the United States, and particularly in Alaska, dealing with disaster relief and the way that these community relocations have happened. And what's happening in Alaska is highly relevant to the rest of the world because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that the most severe consequence of climate change is going to be on population mobility. And the fact that communities all over the world, particularly on the coast, are going to have to relocate is a reality that we need to understand today, because if what's happening in Alaska is any indication of what could potentially happen in other parts of the world, like Manhattan, we are completely unprepared. So this, what I call is this dynamic adaptive governance framework, where you start with disaster relief and then move to a process where community relocations occur. It must be based in human rights doctrine, meaning that the self-determination of communities is priority. Communities need to be listened to in regard to whether or not they want to relocate, and then where they want to relocate to. And then in order to move through this adaptive governance framework that starts with protection in place and moves to community relocation, there need to be social ecological signals or indicators that are decided on by the community and then agreed on by governments, agencies who would provide the technical assistance. And so based on the work that I've done in Alaska, these are some of the signals that are appropriate for Alaska. So the repetitive loss of infrastructures, imminent danger to the community residents where the erosion control and flood devices are not able to protect them, the number of evacuation events, what's happening with public health in regard to potable water. And then it's critical that communities, they have information about what's happening in their community in regard to the environmental changes caused by climate change. But what would be really helpful is to get some of that predictive science, the modeling that's being done to show, like, is Arctic sea ice no longer going to be available around in 50 years? That's critically important to figure out long-term strategies in regard to community habitability. And so because of my dislike, so climate refugees, the reason why that term is inappropriate in this context is refugees, one, it's a term defined by the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees in 1951, which is based on fleeing for political reasons, for persecution. And clearly climate change, you are not being persecuted by any government entity. And the second piece is that refugees, that term in and of itself means that your government is either persecuting you or not willing to assist you. And we need to expect that our nation state governments are going to want to protect all of us. And then I was just at a meeting in Australia where we came up with draft human rights guidelines, because if relocation has to occur, I'm always hesitant to talk about it because it has to be based in human rights doctrine. What we know now about relocations are government mandated relocations that have violated people's human rights. And if relocation is the only option to protect people, we need to have a different paradigm, because it's going to eventually affect millions of people all over the world. Thank you. I don't want to forget that.
I'll disconnect that for you.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Robin. We have time for a few questions, if you don't mind waiting for lunch a little bit longer. Will the questions be recorded as well? So is there a microphone, or should we ask people to speak into here? Why don't we do that so that they're, if we turn that on, we can run it around. And,
Is there another microphone?
just that one, and maybe we can then just pass it to the speakers to respond. So there's a question.
Should I come down?
Yeah, why don't you come down?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And just let us know who you are, and then we can get a response. Please.
Okay, I'm Marguerite. I'm one of the young researchers. I have a question about the relocation. The talk about the relocations in Alaskan communities. I wanted to know. I had a question about the respiratory illnesses. I was wondering, is that to do with something more immediate as well, like something particular to that community? Because this could be my own ignorance of the science, but what is causing the respiratory illness exactly in that community?
So what the public health assessment showed or thought, it's because of the lack of potable water. So there's not enough potable water for people in the community to wash their hands in particular, and that's one of the reasons why there's that level of respiratory illness amongst children.
Okay, and I did have another question. Can I fit two in? Okay, thanks. I also wanted to know if you had seen a difference in the achievement of kind of some accountability at the state level after the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Have you found that has made a difference at all in the time that you have observed this, or not?
And I'll let Patricia also answer, but no, I haven't seen any difference because of the declaration.
No, I think you're exactly right. That's one of the things we're trying to figure out now, is how actually that's going to be implemented. It's
Right.
nice that it's finally signed on to, but there's no implementation strategy.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for your talks as well.
If you come to the front, there, we can pass the mic back to
Sure. Another question on the community relocation. I'm Paul Cunningham from the U.S. Embassy. And I'm wondering, given the length of time that some of these relocations are taking, what is being seen up to this point in terms of community members just getting frustrated and deciding to leave the communities completely, move elsewhere, move to a larger community perhaps. And in the process, as this drags out, what else are you seeing beyond what you talked about here in terms of as the frustration builds over the length of time that it's taking? Are you seeing some new creative responses in terms of what people are thinking about in terms of how to shape the new community when they do ultimately move? Thanks.
Thanks for your questions. And again, I'm going to ask Patricia if she wants to add. So it has been extremely difficult that these relocations have taken as long as they have. When I started doing my research in 2007, every government agency expected that Newtok would be relocated by 2012, which was last year. The largest structure in Newtok is expected to be gone to erosion by 2017. And so there's not a lot of time left, which is understandably causing a lot of concern in not only Newtok, but the other communities that are threatened. I'm not familiar with there being out-migration and folks moving to larger communities. And my sense is, and Patricia, please, add to this or correct me if I'm wrong, is that that's not an option. People are tribes and want to be living together as a tribe, and that's why they've gone to the lengths that they have to document the erosion and to move as a community. And I think the challenge is, well, there are several challenges, but that we don't have a relocation institutional framework in the United States is really problematic. When you have everybody agreeing that relocation needs to occur, but no mechanism with which to make that happen. And in Newtok's situation, and they're furthest along, they are absolutely using this as an opportunity to improve their community. So they want to integrate sustainable development. Stanley Tom sent, I think, like 12 people in his community to get workforce development opportunities so that they could help to build their new community. And so they are thinking about how to make their relocation a positive step for their community in regard to long-term sustainability.
I think you pretty much answered. I just add a couple of things. I think people are being lost in some communities, but not necessarily because of just climate issues. For instance, energy costs in our communities are so extremely high that when our elders are having to pay $1,000 a month just to heat their homes, it simply is not sustainable. So we are losing elders and other people like that who are moving into either homes for elderly in larger communities or into places where they have better health care access, like into Anchorage. So that's becoming an issue, but not just because of climate reasons.
And if I can just say, since you're here, the U.S. seriously has a huge role to play with this because I've been speaking all over the world about this issue, and the way that climate change is affecting population displacement is unique in Alaska and really a forerunner for what's going to happen in other parts of the world. And if the U.S. could be a leader in how to move forward with this, because just with sea level rise, and without permafrost thawing, sea level rise is going to inundate huge cities all around the world. And based on the experience in Alaska, technology is not going to be able to protect us in the long term. Certainly in the short term, there will be the technology, because the technology has been used to protect these communities in place. But I think it's critically important that we think of when technology is no longer able to protect these communities, what are we going to do? And it would be really good if we plan for it now, as opposed to when the crisis happened, because that's what's happening in Alaska. The crisis is now, and we're completely unprepared.
Are there any other questions? Go ahead. You can use the... Yep. I had some questions, but my laptop's here, so... To you guys, my research is similar to what you're doing. Yeah. So basically, my questions are, first of all, regarding the transnational corporations. Are they really so dangerous according to different ways of seeing agency in the Arctic, considering the interest in resources? Because you base it on that model. For example, is this happening through state consensus, investment, and insurance evaluations? Could this kind of make them seem less dangerous? This is another logic. And the other thing was, how does this play into your research findings? I was very interested because it seems like you're taking many different approaches or methodologies and trying to encompass everything, and that's the thing that I'm facing with my own research on exactly the same issue. Energy resources in the Arctic, because everything seems so interrelated, and it's quite a curious thing to see in your own findings that you're coming up with all of these other things. So it's quite a long answer, probably. I don't know. So they're the questions.
On TNCs, I will pass the possibility to answer to Matthias, who is working much more on those actors. But indeed, it's not obvious that we can use the same method exactly for inquiring the perspective of each different actors we have listed there. But that's the challenge to have a system approach. It's to look at the interactions between the actors, because even TNCs have to consider the people who are living around and who are deciding upon the region's policies, and so that's really the challenge, to look at the interactions. But so now I give.
Okay, maybe two things. I mean, to the methodology from your last question. What we are trying to do is to simulate the behavior of the actors, and the stakeholder analysis is just to determine which are the relevant actors at this time today, and to find a methodology. And basically, Andréa didn't have much time at the end, but the methodology doesn't give us the answer. The methodology just gives us the possibility. You still need a framework in which to apply the methodology, and that's the actor relationship. Now through the TNCs, is something I work on in more detail, I think, and especially energy TNCs and then mining. I make a very clear distinction between transnational, privately owned transnational corporations which are much more dependent on concessions, protests, all kind of things, Exxon and these kind of things, and state-owned TNCs, like in particular Gazprom from Russia and Statoil from Norway, which are probably the strongest because of their link to the government, will play, I mean, we put them in a definitive role. They actually, I mean, if you want to, hope nobody Norwegian is here, but it's maybe the country that is run by Statoil. It's not the government that runs the company. It's the other way around. Similar in Russia. So these kind of companies, I think, have much more power in the Arctic than any of the other actors, probably more even than nation states.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I have at least half a dozen questions for the speakers as well, but I think we better go for lunch. We have an hour until the sessions resume this afternoon. Thank you again to all of the speakers.